Welcome to the Citizen Experience Podcast, where we speak with government and business leaders who are bringing positive change and social outcomes for communities across the country. I am your host, Keith Scott. Welcome to the conversation.
Welcome to the Citizen Experience Podcast. I am your host, Keith Scott. I am fortunate enough to have KL Scott and Associates' own Dr. Marlene Orozco with us. Marlene, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for having me.
Great. So you've been with us, I would guess, going on, knock on wood, going on close to a year. And you have an exceptional educational background. And I just wanted to highlight this. You have a bachelor's and PhD in sociology from Stanford and a master's degree in educational policy from Harvard. And your background is primarily research, right?
Correct.
So, what do you see as the difference in making the transition from being a researcher into the world of consulting, and what is the difference? What's the transition, or is it a smooth transition between the two?
I think it's a smooth transition, right? So consultants rely very heavily on data, and that's
Mhm.
been the world that I've been, living and breathing in for the last decade or so.
Right.
And so in that work, right, you have to communicate pretty complex, robust, and rigorous research to wide audiences. And that's what you do as a consultant. You take really nuanced frameworks and concepts and apply them to different organizational settings, and really kind of engage with stakeholders based on kind of what, where they're at.
Yes, and that's the one of the reasons why we said, hey, uh, she'd be a great asset to our team. And one of the things that got me saying, okay, we really have to have this conversation. You wrote a book. I want to get the name of the title right. Advancing U.S. Latino Entrepreneurship. And it's perfect with our social equity work in the field where we're trying to make sure there's economic ladders for all communities of color and underserved communities, right? So go into that book. What is the book about? What inspired you to write the book? And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Advancing US Latino Entrepreneurship is an edited volume. And when I was at Stanford, we convened academics from all across the country, researchers who were studying some facet of Latino entrepreneurship. There's not that very many of us. We come from a number of disciplines. My background, as you mentioned, is in sociology, but we convened economists, we convened folks from agricultural studies, women's studies, you name it. And we came together to talk about our research. And in that, we wanted to fill a gap that we found in the space around really kind of digging deep on Latino entrepreneurship. We had been studying it at the GSB as this growing trend, this growing phenomenon to really keep tabs on, right? We know that the U.S. Latino population is very large. Nearly 1 out of every 5 people in the U.S.
Mhm.
Is
Yep.
Latino. But I think a lesser known fact is that Latinos are actually starting businesses at a faster rate than all other groups and outpacing population growth. So it's not just population trends alone that is fueling this entrepreneurial dynamism. I think that there's a lot to unpack culturally.
Mhm.
And so we wanted to put this book together, again, to talk about it from various disciplines on just this growing phenomenon. Again, Latinos are starting businesses at a faster rate than all others. But of course, when you dig deeper, there's a number of opportunities, but also challenges. And so I was certainly coming at it from the sociological perspective, but also looking at challenges to growth, right? So we know that these businesses are starting rapidly, but we found that, in fact, there are challenges to scale. And I think, certainly this was exacerbated throughout the course of the pandemic. We saw access to capital being a
Yeah.
real hindrance to survival, and the modes in which Latino entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs of color access traditional financing. There's a lot of disparity there that we were unpacking with national bank loans. There's I think a lot of research and historical research that's been done on mortgage lending and redlining practices. But we wanted to really dig in and drill deeper on what the practices were for small business lending. And so, this book, again, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that there's a little bit of something for everybody. And I think the book came at a really opportune moment where, again, we were met with this challenge of the pandemic, this new mode of business. And a lot of the groundwork that we had laid, I think, was really amenable to deriving policy solutions that were that were applicable for the Latino entrepreneur.
So, and I'm a person of color going through the same struggle or similar struggle. And when you're, let's say, in high school, you're a young Latino man or woman, and you're trying to think of something, a career, is the support system there? Because I'm looking at a statistic from Bankrate um, that Hispanic-owned businesses make up about 7% of all businesses in the United States. Just 7%. Now, I don't. This is according to Bankrate.
Mhm.
Now, you said earlier, and I agree, that 20% of the population is Hispanic, Latino.
Mhm.
So there's a disparity there, right? How is the next generation being in position? Because it's a new economy with AI, with this social media influencer thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around on Instagram and everything. What's the younger generation looking forward to in terms of growth? Because I am I'm passionate about um, entrepreneurship, but really reaching those that are untapped. Because if you don't have resources, some of those ideas never come to fruition. How can we, you know, address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge is, you can't be what you can't see. And so
Right.
in our work, we've been really purposeful about sharing the success stories of Latino entrepreneurs who are creating really exciting businesses in tech. In fact, when you kind of cross that threshold, which is a big barrier of going from a self-employed individual to hiring your first employee, once you become an employer business, we actually find that Latinos are equally as represented in tech industries relative
Mhm.
to their white counterparts, um, right? But it's kind of the bottleneck in the funnel that we really have to address. So part of that is seeing and hearing success cases in the media. I worked really closely to showcase and to champion these untold stories, and not just in tech. I think that there's a lot of innovation happening in brick and mortar companies. And many
Mhm.
of our, you started by asking about support systems. Many of our families were quite entrepreneurial, perhaps not in the same way that we think about entrepreneurship today, but there are a lot of parallels to be drawn. When I interview entrepreneurs today, they'll talk about, yeah, my mom had her own sewing company out of our garage, right? That is entrepreneurship. And it's really a matter of having access to resources, certainly capital and mentorship networks that can scale these ideas, and have support somebody in having their a brick and mortar, or transferring their skill set to an online digital space, right? There's a lot
Right.
of um, new technologies, certainly AI. But I think that, when we think about digital presence and digital marketing, um, Latinos over-index on smartphone usage, but we hadn't seen prior to the pandemic that convergence or that transfer of that skill set for personal use to business
Mhm.
use, and amplifying kind of the story of one's own business in these in the digital way. And so, I think that there's a lot of support embedded within the Latino community. As a sociologist, I started to study this topic through the framing of enclaves, right? In the 1980s, sociologists were really curious about the networks, the support networks that were proliferating in Miami. The Cuban enclave, where businesses were starting, and other Cuban immigrants were taking the taking were working in these establishments, and then that was serving as a training ground for them then to open up their own business, right? So there's a lot of kind of a cultural history, and certainly a propensity towards entrepreneurship, and risk taking. I mean, if we think about the Latino experience in the United States, certainly some of those, the border, we didn't cross the border crossed us.
Yeah.
There's long multi-generations of Latinos in the United States, but there's also constant new waves of immigration. And, we find that immigrants have a greater propensity to start businesses than U.S. native borns. And I think
Yeah.
they're driven by that risk taking, right? You're coming to a new country. That in itself is kind of the utmost risk. And so starting a business, doesn't seem as risky, because you've already, relatively have experienced, some life-changing events.
Now, does that dissipate though? Like first generation, really hustling, working hard. Second generation, still working hard, maybe not as hard, and have built a comfortable life. And then the third generation, and so on. Does that lose its momentum over time, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think interesting that the research on this shows that for later generations, their propensity towards entrepreneurship declines. But I think we're seeing a resurgence. And so, for instance, if your immigrant parents came to the country and started a taqueria, which is actually what my parents did, and my dad had started his own construction company, a couple of them,
Mhm.
and but the socialization, the training, or the kind of the cultural direction that we were given was of success was, do well in school, and,
Right.
and get a career at a company, go into the professions, become a lawyer, become a doctor. And so I think that, again, going back to the models and the narratives that exist, if entrepreneurship had been something that was socialized early on as a career pathway, then perhaps I might have thought about it differently. I mean, I study these things now, but I think we're seeing, certainly with kind of the gig economy, and what we're seeing with just kind of all of the social media platforms and the ease of directly engaging with consumers, I think we're seeing a resurgence of entrepreneurial activity, certainly amongst the later generations.
Yeah, the barrier of entry is a lot less than it used to be, right? Before, if you wanted to start a restaurant, you'd have to have, your whole family pitching into a piggy bank, right? And starting a restaurant there. But now, you have the ability to have a catering business that requires a small investment, that can grow into a food truck, that can go into a restaurant, or you can become a consultant with one laptop, right?
That's right.
Social media influencer just with the iPhone camera. It's a lot easier today to start something, whatever it is. Even the music industry has changed, where you don't need the large music distributors anymore. You have YouTube and social media. So things have changed. It's always interesting to me, though, that entrepreneurship to me is a mindset. And I've had this conversation with a lot of folks about, are you born entrepreneur, or do you develop it, right? And for me, I believe it's a learned behavior, almost against the status quo. I don't like being controlled. I like being the ability to draw my own pictures on my own canvas, type of thing. Um, for others, they may not have that. They may become a business owner just because they were laid off and it was not intentional, right? But they succeed, and then they find their way. What have you seen to be successful in the Latino community?
So I think both are true. There's both push and pull dynamics, right?
Right.
You are either pushed into entrepreneurship because you've experienced a bout of unemployment, or
Hmm.
if you're an undocumented immigrant, for instance, you can't seek formal employment, you don't need a social security number. You can start a business with an ITIN, and then kind of generate your livelihood and your income through that pathway. Other entrepreneurs are pulled into entrepreneurship, right? They have an exciting idea, or they might have this mindset, as you
Hmm.
framed it, of wanting to be their own boss, or again, exploring their own ideas. So I think both dynamics are at play. And interestingly enough, for my dissertation, I wanted to look at the outcomes of highly skilled Latinos who
Hmm.
become business owners. Um,
Hmm.
now, in an ideal research environment, you would conduct an experiment, but
Right.
you wouldn't do that with somebody's livelihood. So I did a quasi experimental design where I looked at the outcomes of highly skilled Latinos who were self-employed, and I
Hmm.
compared them to highly skilled Latinos who were in the workforce, and I compared them across several variables, right? So controlling for geography, controlling for education levels, etc. I found that, in fact, the pathway of entrepreneurship is one of greater economic mobility.
Hmm.
And I saw that also kind of highlighted in the interviews that I conducted with entrepreneurs, where many of them had experiences in kind of the traditional labor, the workforce, but had experienced either obstacles or challenges, in some cases discrimination from their
Hmm.
employers, that really pushed them in that case to entrepreneurship. But simultaneously they had developed the skill set in their career, that they can then be successful, and start a comparable company on their own. So I think both factors, it's a really dynamic interplay. It's not just that because you're pushed into entrepreneurship, you're relegated to uh, a company that doesn't have scalable power. I think that it is a very dynamic interplay, and you experience it throughout kind of your own business trajectory, forces of being pushed and pulled throughout.
So I was looking at a study, so maybe a few years ago, about the dollar that recycles in specific communities. I think it recycles 7 times in the white community,
Mm.
less than 2 times in the black community, meaning there's not black business owners supporting black communities, right? Um, is the same challenge in the Latino community, or have you seen that disparity there?
That's an interesting statistic, because certainly from the sociological perspective, what we see from Black and Latino communities when they become successful, there is this propensity, this cultural tie to one's community. Now, whether it's an actual philanthropic dollar that is being codified, or
Mhm.
supporting your family in some
Mhm.
way that perhaps is not as measurable, we see this propensity to give back, and I think it starts with our immediate families forward, and perhaps
Right.
once you continue to grow and scale it and reach new tiers of wealth generation, I think we'll start to see that trickling back. But Jodi Aguias Vallejo from USC, she focuses pretty extensively on the middle class, and we're
Mhm.
starting to see this growing body of Latino philanthropy. So I think it has to do with just gaps of intergenerational wealth where we're playing this
Mhm.
catch-up game. But
Mhm.
hopefully, as we make a concerted effort to really focus in and support um, business owners in their continued trajectory, we'll see that kind of economic development flow to the communities, right? I think one of the things that I was very fortunate to be a part of is my research fueled an executive education program at Stanford
Mhm.
that's focused on businesses that are generating at least $1 million in annual revenue. Now, that's the top 3% of all Latino businesses in the U.S. And you might say, well, why focus on them? They're already successful. They're already big companies. And in fact, what we found is at that level of success, there were
Mhm.
still immense challenges that could impede their continual growth. Access to capital being a primary one, and also mentorship and one's kind of a network. And so this program was devised to really support and continue to build community amongst Latino entrepreneurs from across the country, but also continue to provide them the access to capital and certainly a skill set for continuing to grow their business.
Yeah, and access to capital is very important, of course. That's the bloodline of any business. But you made a good point about mentorship, right? Um, yeah, entrepreneurship is also not easy, right? And so you have to have someone that can help you guide through some of the headwinds that you're going to face, some of the struggles, the what do you call it? The imposter syndrome thing that almost every entrepreneur experiences at some point. Um, are there good organizations that can offer, if I encountered a person that's coming out of college from Stanford, and they're looking for a mentor, where could I guide them? I could definitely be a mentor, but is there a source of mentors that are like nonprofit organizations that really target the Latino community?
Absolutely. So one that collaborates very closely with the Stanford program is the Latino Business Action Network.
Okay.
They're a nonprofit that really fuels this education program and the research as well that is being directed out of Stanford. And they are pulling together a number of mentors from the Latino
Mhm.
community and beyond, with specific skill sets that they then assign to individuals who participate in this executive education program. But there are a number of other bodies, which I'm happy to share and link. With this conversation, that are really doing this purposeful pairing and kind of pairing of mentors. It's
Mhm.
interesting when I speak to entrepreneurs, some of them say, "Oh, I have a," when we talk about mentorship, they say, "I have a mentor," but that person doesn't know that they're my mentor, and it's like, well, that's more of like,
Oh, wow. Okay.
somebody who you look up to, but perhaps there's not
Yeah.
this exchange. And what we find is it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who is where you want to be. We can find
Mhm.
mentorship in our colleagues, in our peers.
Mhm.
These programs that develop these cohort models are so powerful. And we saw this play out throughout the course of the pandemic with participants that had gone through this program. There was this woman who had a coffee company, and she was B2B. So she would
Mhm.
supply her coffee to the big tech firms in the Bay Area. And when they closed and sent all of their employees home, she no longer had this channel to distribute her coffee. And
Mhm.
so she was sharing this with her WhatsApp group, that was generated from the program. And somebody who had a marketing company offered their support, to pull up her page so she can then be direct to consumer and offer her coffee to a broader, consumer base. And she's been wildly successful. Progeny Coffee, and with Maria Palacios, she has a really great product where she features the farm workers from Colombia on her packaging. And
Mhm.
she found this support through the program that she had experienced. And so, I think that there are lots of ways to obtain support, not just through kind of this mentorship model, which we think of somebody
Mhm.
who is highly successful or somewhere where we would want to be or have a particular skill set, but also in our friendship groups and our peer groups and our networks.
So for our listeners may not know what a cohort model is. Could you describe what a cohort model is?
Sure. So it's, when you think about it, for those of us who have gone to college, right, and lived in a dorm setting, right, like you're having this shared experience with a group of people. Similarly, there's a lot of programs that are structured through this cohort model where you can learn from as much from your peers as you can from the set curriculum or the objective of the program that you're experiencing. And in fact, the mantra of this education program is to do business with each other and get business for each other, right? So
Mhm.
it brings together companies, Latino companies from across the country in a number of industries, right? So not just tech focused. We have traditional brick and mortars, and we have wholesale distributors, and we have transportation companies. And once they've, been in the room with like-minded individuals and have this shared experience, I think there's a lot of business to be had, a lot of shared learning and community building that happens through a
Yeah.
cohort model.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I when I started years ago, there was a network. I was a business network international. That's kind of the cohort model, and there I found my attorney, my financial manager, my accountant, all in that one group. And if you don't do business with each other, you actually can give. We're all kind of separated by 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever that phrase is. They can introduce you to someone in your network. So I do think cohort models are great, right? You got to get out of the. We all live in this virtual world now. You got to get out. You got to network. Um, One of the things that I like just doing is just getting into conferences that sometimes don't really have anything to do with our business, KL Associates, but it gives us a different perspective, and you can get new ideas, you get new connections, and you never know who you might meet, right? One of the things that I'm also seeing is, particularly after 2020, the murder of George Floyd, there's been a lot of VC and PE investment in businesses. Have you also seen that? Or is there any specific organization that you've seen a lot of venture capital coming from to help kind of launch and spur some innovation in Latino businesses?
Yeah, I think with this spotlight on racial injustice, and certainly kind of historical challenges to accessing capital, I think
Right.
it's really fueled a new generation of capital sources and buildings. So we're starting to see some Latinos and
Mhm.
Black entrepreneurs go into the VC space and start their own funds. And what is really important to note is these aren't just impact funds. There's a real business
Right.
case to be made, right? We're
Right.
we're seeing the returns of supporting, investing in minority businesses. They're more likely to hire people from the community, and again, it fuels this whole cycle of economic development. But I think that there was this spotlight of the lack of VC funding going to Black and
Mhm.
Latino entrepreneurs. So there's been some efforts. Crunchbase, I worked with them to set up their diversity tags, right? So you can
Mhm.
look at VC dollars going to entrepreneurs of color, but also the VCs that are led by entrepreneurs of color. And there's some legislative movement in this direction. California passed
Mhm.
a bill that's set to take effect into 2025, where VCs have to be transparent about who they're investing in across
Mhm.
racial and ethnic demographic groups. And so, I think it's important to continue to measure this, and to see hopefully some trends over time. It's certainly still not at a prolific level, but I think
Yeah.
we are seeing kind of really creative ways to obtain funding both in the debt and equity space. And certainly crowdfunding as well, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
another way that folks are kind of being creative. Um, Grants were really pivotal and critical
Mhm.
throughout the course of the pandemic for survival, but we're also starting to see them for more sustained purposes, right? Sometimes you just need an immediate infusion of cash to
Mhm.
secure your next location. And so I think we're starting to see some really purposeful grant making also happening.
And that's very important because in any company you have different phases of growth, right? You have your starting point, and sometimes you can just do it through sweat equity, right? You roll up your sleeves, you get it done, and then you reach a cap where you have to hire people, you have to scale, you have to bring in more investment, and there's another level of risk. Venture capital, crowdfunding, I would say everything other than banks will work in this. And I'm not a a huge fan of banks. Sorry. Um, and those of you trying to start your own business, you'll find out as soon as you go to one to try and get a loan without collateral. So, but having those alternative sources of funding is very important. But where I see the disconnect is understanding where to go, right? I have this idea, but what do I do with it? And I've seen a lot of dreams die on at that point, right?
Yeah.
How, and I think I may have even alluded to this question earlier, what is the best way for anyone to just go to do a search on Google? And what's the first thing they should look for when they're at that point?
So you can definitely go locally to your the small business development centers. There's one, I believe, in every single county. So you can go
Right.
there, and there's staff that can help direct your questions to, how do I set up my business?
Mhm.
Where can I get funding? If you want to kind of do some of this self-directed learning, I would point you to a website called Hello Alice, which is really kind of curating resources, funding opportunities, learning materials for entrepreneurs, really personalized to the industry that you're in. So go to helloalice.com. It was co-founded by a Latina, and so definitely recommend that. I will note on banks. Our research certainly has shown that national banks, there are longstanding challenges, and in fact, several inequities that we uncovered. But
Mhm.
a lifeline of for businesses really has come from small local and community banks, community
Mhm. Yep.
development financial institutions in particular,
Yep.
CDFIs, who are really putting in the legwork to working with historically underbanked communities and having all of these high touch points, and are kind of working really hard to get those that are underbanked, and again have been left behind in many ways, credit lines and access to products. So definitely would encourage some research to CDFIs. They were critical throughout the course of the pandemic in deploying, um, you know, uh, funding from the Paycheck Protection Program.
Mhm.
But there's a lot. I mean, I think you can. It's a good problem to have, that there's a lot of resources and activities and organizations that are really focused on supporting entrepreneurs and business owners. But I think you can also be inundated with information. And so, streamline your search efforts. If you want to go locally, check out your SBDCs, but also websites like Hello Alice that are really customizing and tailoring your experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marlene. We're right at time, and we didn't even get to dig into the great work that you're doing here at KL Scott and Associates. So that's part two at some point,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
It's open invitation, but uh, Latino entrepreneurship is very important to me. I wanted to give you a voice and help with the community. How can folks that are interested in learning more about you, your CV, how can they get in contact with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Um, that's a pretty direct way. Would always love to chat with college students, with business owners, with anybody who has a question, and certainly happy to provide PDF versions of my book as well for anybody who reaches out.
All right. Dr. Orozco is a brilliant consultant and researcher. You do yourself a big favor by reaching out and finding out a lot about Latino entrepreneurship. And again, thank you, listeners. Another podcast. This is our first episode of season 2. And I'm pleased to have Dr. Orozco kick us off. But again, thank you for joining the conversation. And we look forward to the next series. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Citizen Experience Podcast with your host, Keith Scott. If you're interested in creating a strategic plan that builds a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce, please contact us at dei@klscottassociates.com, or you can call at 404-692-5552. Thank you for joining the conversation.